Joining me to discuss what a second Trump administration could mean for U.S. foreign policy is Anel Sheine, former U.S. State Department official who resigned in protest of the Biden administration's support of Israel's war on Gaza. Stephen Walt, author of The Israel Lobby in U.S. Foreign Policy. He's also professor of international relations at Harvard University. And Omar Badar, political analyst and former deputy director at the Arab American Institute. Thank you all for joining me. Now I'm going to start with you. 2024 President-elect Donald Trump has made a round of personnel announcements for his upcoming administration. We have staunch Israel supporter Mike Huckabee. He'll be nominated as ambassador to Israel. Mike Waltz is set to be national security advisor. Marco Rubio is set to be Secretary of State, and Elise Stefanik as UN ambassador. Are you expecting radical change in policy from Washington based on these personnel decisions?
I mean, to be clear, policy was already in such an awful place under the Biden administration. However, I do anticipate that things will get worse, especially with someone like former Governor Mike Huckabee, who is a committed evangelical Christian, has talked about the fact that the Palestinian people do not exist. He's described Israeli settlements as simply neighborhoods. What you hear from Israeli ministers is that they're planning to annex the West Bank. You have settlers waiting to move back into Gaza as soon as the firing has stopped. So although obviously things are already so horrifyingly bad under the current administration, but I do worry that moving forward, we will simply continue to see these same policies, as well as greenlighting the annexation of the West Bank, for example. And the concern there would be, could this spark conflict perhaps with Jordan?
Stephen, what do you make of this? Do you see a radical policy shift, or do you see this as a more intensified version of the current policy?
Yeah, I think the latter phrase describes it. You're certainly not going to see anything better than the bad policy we had under Biden, and it could easily get substantially worse. Two other points. The one person you didn't mention was the designee for Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. This hasn't been confirmed, but I've seen at least one video of him giving a speech declaring his support for the extremist idea of rebuilding the Third Temple in Israel, which implies destroying the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site in Islam. If that's what he really believes, you're going to have yet another zealot, in this case, running the Defense Department. The other point I'd note is that all of these people, and I think some other folks in the administration, are hardline anti-Iran hawks. Right. Remember, it was Trump who took us out of the nuclear deal with Iran and allowed Iran to get closer to a nuclear weapon. But if they take a very hardline posture towards Iran as well, then the danger of a war in the Middle East goes up, even if Trump would rather avoid that.
Omar, we also have seen some of the hardline right-wingers in Israel celebrate Donald Trump's victory, and we could speculate why. I'm thinking about Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. I'm also thinking about Bezalel Smotrich, who's the finance minister. They were on social media. They were in other spaces openly celebrating the Trump victory. In many ways, they are ideologically aligned with the likes of Mike Huckabee, who in 2015 compared Israel's claim to the West Bank as equivalent to the United States' sovereignty over Manhattan. Does Israelis' right wing get more emboldened or maybe even empowered after the election of Donald Trump?
Yeah, I mean, it's again funny because we are already speaking about a low point before all of this happened. But what you had is a government in Biden that gave Israel what it wants in terms of military funding and diplomatic protection for the atrocities they were committing against Palestinians, but always with some level of tension. It's always with some U.S. discontentment of publicly criticizing indiscriminate bombings or talking about the need that they would never accept a reoccupation of Gaza. There's always this rhetoric about tension, and what they get in a Trump administration that is staffed with these complete religious fanatics is the enthusiastic support for Israel's plans. That there is no longer this pretense about the U.S. supporting Palestinian human rights, supporting Palestinian statehood, and that effectively is a recipe for atrocities that are even greater than the ones that we have seen so far. And it's a really terrifying prospect because even the official numbers of what's coming out of Gaza right now is certainly an underestimate, that you can't get the full magnitude of the atrocities that have been committed. And now, if you're going to endorse Israel's expansionist policies and Israel's attempt to liquidate the Palestinian struggle for freedom and justice once and for all and eliminate that for Israel moving forward, we are looking at an absolutely horrifying situation and a prospect of a very, very dangerous escalation in the region.
No, I keep hearing this idea that under Trump it'll get even worse because there's not even a pretense of concern, as you just talked about, Omar, for Palestinian human rights, et cetera. Is there any reason to believe that the Biden administration's posture was restraining Israel at all, though? I mean, after looking at Gaza, it's hard for some people to believe that it mattered at all.
No, I mean, I certainly agree with you that the idea that Biden was doing anything to try to prevent what Israel was trying to do is false. And in many ways, I think this does contribute. I mean, as Omar was saying, getting rid of the pretense at least gets rid of the hypocrisy. I mean, in many ways, I think this contributes to this perception of Trump as someone who means what he says and speaks openly and honestly, and even if the things he's saying are horrible. Whereas you have the Democrats and the Biden administration, as Omar said, pretending to care about human rights, pretending to care about the international order and the rule of law, and yet acting completely against it. And so, I mean, in many ways, I think that what the Biden administration has done has further undermined these causes of human rights or the international order. And instead, what we're going to see under Trump is just this full embrace and an open, spoken embrace of the policies that Biden administration was implementing anyway.
Yeah. I mean, you resigned from the State Department because of the Biden administration's continual political support, military support for Israel. Is there any reason to believe what the Biden administration representatives would likely say and have said in the past, which is we're doing the best we can, we're behind the scenes pushing Israel, they're just not listening?
No, the U.S. has massive leverage. The U.S. could have at any point upheld American law, which under U.S. laws, Israel is no longer eligible to receive U.S. security assistance. This was the gist of the 30-day letter where the administration
which passed a few days before this taping.
Exactly. So this was openly acknowledging from the administration that Israel is blocking humanitarian aid, which renders Israel no longer eligible to receive U.S. security assistance, and yet they gave them 30 extra days. There's no provision in U.S. law whereby they should have 30 extra days to continue starving people illegally, and yet this has already been happening for more than a year.
Yeah. And you know, the expression that comes to mind is put your money where your mouth is, and that's, you had a Biden administration that was saying that they want Israel to change course, while at the same time telling Netanyahu that we're going to give you all the weapons that you want, all the military funding that you want, and we're going to shield you diplomatically. Well, then you're not really asking them to change behavior when you make it clear that you're going to support whatever they do. There's an abdication of responsibility and effectively a subcontracting of American foreign policy to Netanyahu. You're allowing Netanyahu to shape American policy, which is to say that continued American support for whatever Israel chooses to do. That is a recipe for failure.
Stephen, Marco Rubio, Donald Trump's selection for Secretary of State has been known for his hardline stances on U.S. foreign policy. He fully supported Israel in its war on Gaza. What should we expect in terms of policy, but also in terms of blowback?
I mean, I think, you know, as Trump himself said back in 2016, Marco Rubio is a lightweight. I don't think anybody takes his ideas on foreign policy as being particularly sophisticated or well thought out. He's been bought and paid for by AIPAC and others for a long, long time. So very pro-Israel. He's also a real China hawk, which is something, of course, that I think attracted him to Trump. And in fact, the administration is going to be very hardline on China, at least in appearance. I think the other point to note about all of these appointments, though, is that they are relatively weak individuals in the sense that they don't have independent power bases of their own. They don't have a lot of stature. You know, a Fox News commentator doesn't have a big independent power base, et cetera. I think that's true of Rubio. I think that's also even true of Mike Waltz. I look at the set of people he's nominated this time, and they look to me like people who aren't likely to stand up to Trump. And if they did try to stand up, he wouldn't face much political cost in jettisoning them down the road. In other words, he's setting things up so that the White House, you know, his chief of staff, whoever he decides to appoint to key positions there, are going to be able to do pretty much whatever Donald wants to do.
Omar, what about the wider region here? And last year, Israel has bombed Lebanon, Yemen. It's targeted officials and military facilities in Iran as well. And Trump has said openly that Israel should bomb Iran's nuclear facilities and, quote, worry about the rest later. With Trump in the White House, do we dramatically increase the chances of an all-out war between Israel and Iran?
I think we do increase that risk. I mean, Trump has this reputation of sort of being an anti-war president because of some exploitative rhetoric he's used in places like Michigan, talking about ending the wars and bringing peace and all of that.
He says no wars. Yeah. There were no wars under Trump.
Yeah, it's utter nonsense. When you look at his actual record, actually, it's stuff that just flies under the radar and people give him a pass for it. But you've had an expansion of the drone war in the region with far more significant civilian casualties because he did away with any kind of calculus about risk to civilians. And so you had thousands upon thousands of people being killed by the drone warfare under the Trump administration, a significant expansion of it that compared to under Obama. You've had a facilitation of Saudi Arabia's war on Yemen, also with devastating consequences, tens of thousands of people at least being killed, if not hundreds of thousands more likely. That has also unfolded under his watch. And for somebody who allegedly does not want war, the assassination of General Soleimani in Iraq brought the U.S. to the brink of war with Iran. And as Trump himself seems to lack any basic understanding of international politics and decision-making, that whatever decision he decides to make is on a whim without really a deep understanding of the consequences of his actions, I think that we are closer than ever to the possibility of a much wider regional war that does get direct Iranian involvement. And that means the utter devastation of the entire region and possibly a death toll that we have not seen in that region for a very, very long time.
Stephen, I take what Omar says seriously. At the same time, I also know that Trump is very war averse, at least for his rhetoric. He doesn't want to be seen as a wartime president. Will that pull him away from the brink of war, or are all bets off now when Iran gets in the mix?
Yeah, I disagree just slightly, a sort of nuanced point from what Omar just said. I mean, I think Trump understands that wars in the Middle East have been very bad for his predecessors, right? The war in Gaza was bad for Biden. Obama never quite got out of some of the wars we were in as well. Certainly it was a disaster for the Bush administration. I don't think he wants to see American ground troops somewhere in the Middle East and unable to get out in various ways. He even tried to remove some of our troops from the Middle East when he was president first term. That doesn't mean he's averse to using force, as we just heard. He's willing to use drones. He'd be willing to use American air power because he doesn't think that that's actually going to have consequences for Americans. It's not going to lead to American lives being lost. It's not going to be that expensive. What he doesn't understand here is that once you start using large amounts of military force, you start to lose control of exactly what happens after that. It's one of the reasons you see countries like Saudi Arabia actually, I think, trying to pull back a little bit, trying to improve relations with Iran, not wanting to see military force get used in large quantities because they know they're going to be affected. So my fear is not that Trump is willing to, go to a big war in the Middle East the way George W. Bush was in 2003. It's rather he would do smaller things, thinking there's no danger of expansion or escalation, and he would wake up later to discover that he was facing a much bigger problem that might involve actually much deeper American involvement.
How likely is that to happen in your estimation?
I mean, I think Stephen makes a really good point. And knowing the amount of money that a lot of these Gulf leaders are shelling out to Trump and his family to say, hey, let's maybe avoid an unnecessary war with Iran, because we know that these countries right now are really trying to focus on economic development. They did learn some lessons from things like the war in Yemen, which ended up taking much longer. And, as Steve pointed out, that there were unanticipated consequences of that kind of violence. So I think that if there's anything to feel at all optimistic about, it might be that certain key leaders in the GCC have had a taste of what war is and are hopefully going to be pushing for less confrontation.
Just on that point, it's kind of interesting to think about the fact that we have world leaders looking for ways to flatter Trump personally as a way to influence American policy, and creating that dynamic in the world where decisions about war and peace depend on whether you ingratiate yourself with Mr. Trump or not. That is not how the world should work, and it ought to be an alarming sign for everyone about the fact that this is who a significant portion of Americans have decided is the man who's fit to lead the world in this really dangerous moment.
All right, I also want to ask about other foreign policy implications of a second Trump presidency. Steve, I'm going to go to you. Trump has been very critical of the Biden administration's aid to Ukraine. He also said he would end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. After he comes to power, it'll all be done in a day, although he doesn't say how. What do you think his approach to this conflict is going to be?
Well, I think this is not good news for Ukraine, needless to say. I actually believe that Harris, had she been elected, would also have moved to try to end the war in Ukraine as quickly as possible. But she would have tried to do so as responsibly as possible and in a way that got Ukraine the best deal it could. I think Trump is much more likely to simply wash his hands of the problem and declare it to be the Europeans, if they want to keep Europeans' problem, if they want to keep supporting Ukraine. I think the idea that he will try to push through a big aid package through a Republican Congress is very unlikely. The big question for Trump, though, is exactly what does Putin do? If Putin is satisfied with part of Ukraine and a peace deal that leaves Ukraine weak and outside of NATO, then Trump, of course, will trumpet this as a great peacemaking deal that he succeeded with. If, on the other hand, Putin's ambitions are greater than that, and he actually wants more of Ukraine than he has now, then Trump runs the danger of, if he sells out Ukraine, looking weak and naive. But in any case, I think that, of all the countries that had something to worry about, Ukraine is probably at the top of the list right now.
Absolutely. And now, on that point, I mean, how do you forecast this? I mean, does Trump ultimately, in your estimation, pursue a path that leads to Ukraine having to concede more territory to Russia?
I mean, that is certainly what he talked about on the campaign trail, what his rhetoric would lead us to believe. And so far in the people he's appointed, there haven't been many clear signals about what exactly this will portend for Ukraine. I mean, I think in general, the extent to which that message resonated with Americans, that Americans are tired of spending this unnecessary money abroad, of sending all this money to Israel, money to Ukraine, when people are struggling to pay their grocery bills at home. I think this is a crucial part of his appeal and his messaging, as Omar mentioned, as the sort of anti-war candidate, as incorrect as that may ultimately prove. But that, in general, my hope is that the Democrats take a lesson from this, that continuing to pursue policies that drag the U.S. into unnecessary wars or continue to spend money unnecessarily abroad, this is something that resonates. And so I truly hope that in upcoming elections, Democrats will implement those lessons.
Stephen, Trump has consistently criticized NATO, particularly when it comes to member countries not meeting their financial obligations toward the alliance. He's even suggested that the U.S. would ignore a key part of the treaty and not defend certain NATO allies if they were to face aggression from places like Russia. How far do you think Trump will go regarding NATO? Would it be an overstatement or hyperbolic for me to say that there's a chance Trump could withdraw the U.S. from NATO altogether?
Yeah. Well, over here in Europe, this is the 64,000 euro question. I mean, we know that Trump's deeply hostile to the European Union, so he won't want to do anything to support that. But NATO is a more complicated problem for him. NATO is still actually a pretty popular institution with the American public. And if he tried to formally withdraw from the NATO treaty, he was going to face some pushback, from the Pentagon, from other parts of the foreign policy establishment. So I think it's entirely possible he'll stay formally within NATO while declaring and putting lots of pressure on European countries to spend a lot more on defense, and in particular by saying they should be spending that money here in the United States, buying American weapons. He's not going to want to see Europe ramp up its own defense industries, potentially become a competitor to the United States or a more effective competitor on global arms markets. And that may be a more effective Trumpian strategy than simply withdrawing from the treaty and removing all American influence from Europe's strategic future course.
Omar, Trump has repeatedly, as I said earlier, branded himself as the anti-war president. How likely is it that he'll be able to retain that title, even under the terms you talked about earlier, the drone wars and such, moving forward? Is there a way, given the sort of arrangement of geopolitical circumstances right now, where Trump can continue to even move in that direction?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very, very difficult just because the region right now in the Middle East is a tinderbox, and he seems to be completely unequipped to move us in a path of de-escalation. So I think that's going to be a very difficult reputation to hold on to. But to Anel's point, all of this is ultimately about the American public's frustration with the U.S. spending money on everywhere else in the world except on the American people. When you ask, why are we the only industrialized country that does not have universal health care? Reason is we don't have money for it. When you talk about so many things that are broken inside the country, the answer is always it's because we don't have any money for it, and yet we constantly have money to throw at other countries to engage in these lengthy wars. And there is something to be said about that, is whatever your critique is of the foreign policy itself, we obviously have a bloated military budget, and that's really what it comes down to, the fact that the Pentagon cannot pass an audit, the fact that all of this money ends up in the pockets of military contractors, private military contractors, at the expense of the American people. And that's not going to be something that Trump is going to change. And so whatever foreign policy looks like in its details, we're still going to have a situation in which we waste all of our money on an over-bloated military budget instead of taking care of the needs of the American people. And that's ultimately going to get in the way of Trump selling himself as somebody who restored the well-being and put America first in any way.
Now, while U.S. foreign policy has always been driven by self-interest, Trump's first presidency pushed this ideology further through this America First doctrine, which embodied a more kind of stringent isolationist policy. Under a second Trump presidency, is there a danger that this will become even more aggressive and more dangerous? Will the America First logic drive even more decision-making? Will we see Trump, for example, withdraw from climate deals like he did before? Will he pull out of global alliances? What do you see a second Trump presidency producing in that regard?
Well, he's already made clear he's going to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord again. And he's been also very clear that he has scorn for the UN. You know, already the U.S. is not funding UNRWA, the agency responsible for the welfare of Palestinian people and refugees. So I anticipate that he will further undermine international institutions writ large, including things like the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, both of which are trying to pursue some measure of justice and accountability for Palestine. But, you know, more broadly, this question of putting America first, as Omar was saying, I mean, there's a reason this resonates with people, that spending all this unnecessary money abroad on wars. We've talked about the power of the Israel lobby, but the defense lobby, so much bigger and more powerful, spending huge amounts of money to both parties to maintain these bloated military budgets, to spend all this money unnecessarily when, again, we're not actually spending money to address the problems that people are having here at home. So if to any extent Trump actually maintains an America First foreign policy, meaning that he's going to avoid unnecessary entanglements or wars abroad, I think that is likely to be a winning electoral strategy. If Americans feel that he is able to somehow avoid the escalations that we've already talked about are quite likely given the current trajectory, but if somehow he manages to navigate around them, I anticipate that this will continue to be something that resonates with people, that they would rather have these resources spent on addressing problems here at home. And again, that America's track record of being the indispensable nation on the world stage has largely simply produced violence and horror abroad, at least in the living memory of those of us who sort of observed what U.S. foreign policy has done on the world stage. It has not been a legacy of peace and prosperity. It has been violence and destruction.
That'll have to be the last word there. Stephen Walt, Omar Badar, Anel Sheine, thank you all so much for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you.
All right. Everybody, that is our show. UpFront, we'll be back.